Hi everybody, thank you so much for following my online presentation. My name is Monica Alexandrina Irimia and I come from the University of Modena and Reggio Emilia. I'm very happy to present at the Seoul International Conference on Generative Grammar, and today I will be discussing some problematic types of differential object marking, and I will be showing that they are best analyzed under the assumption that they involve the presence of more than one case assigner or more than one case licenser acting on the same nominal. I will be illustrating with two case studies from Uzbek and non-standard Basque, but for those of you who have also looked at the proceedings paper, you saw there some data from Finnish too supporting the same conclusion. Proceeding now with some background on differential object marking, as it is well known, this is a pervasive phenomenon which indicates splits in the morphosyntactic behavior of objects. And taking this back case study for now, we see in this language that direct objects come in two types. On the one hand, there is the unmarked nominal in 1a, which gets interpreted as a non-specific category and is also number neutral. But on the other hand, there is also the marked nominal in B, which takes the ni morphology, also known as the accusative case marker in traditional grammars. This ni morphology gives rise to a definite interpretation. Generally, we see here a picture which is quite robust cross-linguistically, namely that definites specific DPs, also grammaticalized animates require a special marking. Now, in minimalism, there are two main ways to approach this data. On one type of account, a DOM signals the difference between cased marked nominals and caseless nominals. So more specifically, the non-specific unmarked nominal in 1a is linked to a process of pseudo-incorporation, for example, because it is caseless when it comes to structural case, and this is seen in 2. On the other hand, the marked nominal in 1b has a structural case feature, and this case feature would require licensing, valuation, or checking in the syntax. And under many accounts, this operation can only be implemented after DP raising above VP or even above light V. A second approach is based on the so-called dependent case calculus, and here the idea is that the accusative case feature on the marked object forces their raising into a domain in which they're entering into a competition with a higher argument. For example, they raise into a domain where the external argument is also found, as the external argument C commands the object, that is DP1, C commands DP2, DP2 will be marked as accusative in a language like Uzbek, because Uzbek is a nominative accusative language. The problem for us is that in many languages, objects show a way more refined picture, and we will also introduce here non-standard Basque varieties in which direct objects in fact show a tripartite picture. There are objects that show up not only bare but also without absolutive agreement, but there are also objects that show absolutive agreement, as in 5a. Basque is an ergative absolutive language, so therefore the verbal complex will show ergative agreement, but it will also show absolutive agreement in this case. And crucially, besides these agreeing absolutives, there are also types of direct objects which generally encode grammaticalized humanness, and these types of objects will have to be realized with dative morphology, constructing a type of the so-called oblique DOM. And an example is in 5b. These objects also trigger dative agreement on the verbal complex. And the question is here how to set aside the agreeing absolutive in 5a from oblique DOM in 5b, given that it is not clear that they're found in distinct positions, and also, as we will see in section 4, given the observation that they're both active in the syntax and they both need a licensing operation in the syntax. In fact, if we go back to the Uzbek split, we will see that things are not as simple as they might seem, because nominals, bare unmarked nominals as those in 1a, are active in the syntax, and they are active for the case calculus, and we'll see the data for that. And moreover, it's not clear that the unmarked and the marked nominal are found in distinct positions. The solution we are exploring here basically connects oblique DOM in non-standard BASC and the knee marker in Uzbek to a separate licensing operation beyond case on complex nominals. So basically, we are dealing here with nominals as in 6a and 6b, which contain not only the DP layer, let's say in non-standard BASC, or the NP layer in Uzbek, but they also contain a layer with interpretable features, which I abbreviated here as delta P for convenience. As the DP and the NP contain a case feature which requires valuation in the syntax, something else must be done with respect to the valuation of this additional delta feature. So the problem basically reduces to the fact that the initial licensor endowed with accusative case features will value the case feature, but then an additional licensor will be needed for the additional interpretable feature in delta. So the idea is that an additional licensor is recruited possibly as a last resort operation, something that has been claimed for DOM before, for example, at least in Regl in 1982. And this additional licensing mechanism is relevant at the syntax semantics pragmatics interface because it is connected to the valuation of an interpretable feature tracking the role of animates or how the speaker relates to other entities in the discourse. So moving on to the first case study, namely Uzbek, we start here from the observation made elsewhere with respect to Turkic languages, namely that it's not the case that unmarked direct objects always show adjacency to V across Turkic. So thus, because they do not do so, they might do so in Saha, a Turkic language Baker and Virokurova discussed, but they might not have this property in all Turkic languages. It's not clear that raising or the dependent case calculus is what sets DOM aside. It could be the case that both marked and unmarked nominals raise, so then something else has to be said about DOM. For Uzbek, as Levin, Forsyth, and Kagan have actually shown, bare nominals come in two types. On the one hand, there is the bare nominal in 7a, which has a reduced structure, probably a number P structure or an NP structure, and establishes a type of pseudo-incorporation. But there is also the nominal in 7b, which rather has a minimal N structure and is only possible with light verbs, for example, verbs like do, make, give, and so on. We are interested in here in pseudo-incorporated nominals, which show syntactic independence in the clause. For example, they can be separated from the verb by intervening adverbs, as in 8. In 8, we see the nominal code separated from the verb where by modal adverbs and so on. And crucially, these types of pseudo-incorporated nominals have a case feature which is active in the syntax, and the data comes here from contexts that contain three arguments, for example, causatives. As we see in 9a, there is a causer Medina, a causi Anvar, and the theme pair. A rule in Turkic languages, in many Turkic languages, is that a structure cannot contain two accusatives. So that thus in 9a, if the pair, the theme takes DOM, the causi cannot be marked with DOM, but it must in fact take dative. We cannot assume here that causative morphology forces or always forces a dative type of marking on the causes, because in 9b we see a causi that shows with DOM, but in this case the verb is intransitive and it does not contain an accusative object, so therefore there is no competition with the accusative on the causi. Crucially for us, if we look at the pseudo-incorporated theme in 9C, that is the bare nominal pair, we notice that it triggers competition with DOM on the COSY. So this indicates that this pseudo-incorporated nominal has a case, an accusative case feature, just like DOM. The truly incorporated nominals, the ones that show up with allied verbs, do not seem to have this accusative case feature, so therefore they do not trigger competition with DOM on the COSY, which can show up easily. We cannot say that the pseudo-incorporated nominal in 9C probably maybe contains, let's say, a lexical or inherent type of case, because we have examples like 9E in which the theme carries, let's say, a lexical ablative triggered by the verb get tired. We notice in here that this lexical ablative does not cause competition with the accusative on DOM. So this indicates that the bare pseudo-incorporated nominal in 9C does not have lexical type of case marking. But then the question is, if the pseudo-incorporated nominal has a structural accusative case feature just like DOM, what is the difference between these two nominals? Why is one of them marked with ni and the other one is not marked with ni? The accusative case feature doesn't seem to be the difference here. In order to understand the contrast here, we can further look at examples like 9F. In 9F, the theme carries this time an ablative which is interpreted as a partitive. This partitive has a definiteness and specificity feature, and notice that this feature triggers a contrast and a conflict with the accusative case feature on the COSY, so therefore the dative must be used instead of the expected DOM on the COSY. So this tells us that the contrast between 9E and 9F is given by the specificity definiteness feature in the partitives. This feature is active in syntax and requires adequate licensing, just like definiteness in DOM, which is similarly active in syntax. So then DOM involves the syntactic licensing of a feature beyond the syntactic licensing of case, and thus DOM shares characteristics with both pseudo-incorporated nominals in 9A and 9C, as we see in 9A and in 9C, but it also shows similarities with structural ablatives. So in order to capture this behavior, the hypothesis that DOM involves a structural feature which requires licensing beyond the case will give the results. As the initial licensor licenses the case feature, for example, like V, an additional licensor will be recruited for the feature beyond case in DOM, and we can use here the alpha head Lopez proposes for the, let's say, licensing of differential objects. We can also further say that unmarked pseudo-incorporated nominals may be involve the removal of the ni marker RPF because the definiteness feature is missing there. Let's move on to the second case study from non-standard Basque. As we have seen, the language shows an animacy-based DOM system. And as again illustrated in 11, direct objects at the higher end of the animacy and person hierarchy generally show up with the special marker, which is homophonous with the dative. And these objects also trigger dative agreement on the auxiliary. Now, the question and the problem for us is that direct object in non-standard Basque can also show up with absolutive agreement on the verbal complex. And remember the example we repeat here in 12. Here, the absolutive object computer triggers absolutive agreement on the verbal complex. And moreover, some speakers allow human DPs and pronouns without oblique DOM, but with absolutive agreement, as in 13. So the contrast between 13 and 11. Generally, in the language, oblique dom is structurally similar to absolutives despite its overt dative appearance, and it does not seem to have the syntax of inherent dative nominals, and there are various diagnostics indicating and supporting this conclusion. For example, oblique dom allows depictive secondary predicates unlike dative indirect objects, and we see the contrast clearly in 14a versus 14b. In 14a, the depictive secondary predicate happy cannot be hosted by the dative argument grandmother, while in 14b, barefoot, the depictive secondary predicate barefoot can be hosted by the dative marked DOM argument, the kid. Other properties that show that oblique dom is not the same thing as let's say an inherent dative is the fact that dom is conditioned by closer properties like tense, a type of behavior datives do not show, and it triggers PCC effects. We can briefly look at the data in 15. In 15a, the structure contains a dative mark argument, the così pelo, and it also contains the theme u. Both the così and the theme require licensing and agreement on the verbal complex, but as the verbal complex has only one locus for agreement with internal arguments, the structure will become ungrammatical. In 15b, the same problem. There is a dative grandma which needs to agree, to show agreement on the verbal complex, but there is also the differentially marked object an, which also needs licensing on the verbal complex. As the verbal complex contains only one licenser for internal arguments, the structure results in ungrammaticality. These two objects require licensing, but only one of them can get it. Fernandez and Rezac propose an account which links oblique dom to object shift, and for them, just like the absolutive, oblique dom reflects a structural agree or case relation with properties on high clausal heads, such as T or light V, and the absolutive basically emerges when conditions for dom are not met, and their more precise assumption is that the agree or case locus for absolutive objects is a probe on V, and the difference between the absolutives and dom is given by the presence of a P feature on light V, which triggers object shift. And basically, the two authors motivate object shift by theory internal reasons. That is, by the observation that in many other languages, animacy and specificity generally feed this type of operation. So we end up with the generalization in 16, namely that P is a trigger for object shift associated with interpretive conditions in the way as it has been discussed for other types of object shift. The problem here is that while DOM as object shift is definitely correct for many languages, we do not know whether absolutive arguments themselves do not raise. And this is a problem Fernandez and Rezac themselves noticed. And they say that their analysis is preliminary, and Audria notices the same problem too. Under the proposal entertained here, the difference between DOM and absolutives is the fact that DOM contains this feature beyond case, which requires separate licensing. And following assumptions, general assumptions in the literature, we can say that grammaticalized animacy is connected to the presence of a person feature. Therefore, we end up with a nominal that contains both case and the person feature, and the differential marker results from the impossibility of the main licensor to license the two features. An additional licensor is recruited, and we follow Pancheva and Zubizarreta, and assuming that the additional licensor is an apple head, because for these two authors, notions such as animacy, which they collapse, which perspectivization and viewpoint are encoded as an interpretable feature in an apple head. This will also explain the use of datives as domin in Basque. So then to conclude, we have seen here types of differential object marking which cannot be easily reduced to case marked versus caseless distinction or to dependent case mechanism. They are instead unified by the presence of more than one licensor acting on the same nominal. This derives not only their similarities with other structural accusatives and absolutives, but also their differences. And I'll stop here because I'm running out of time, but I will be more than happy to answer your questions.